This video is going to explain how to do imaginary numbers in the calculator. One way you can do imaginary numbers is knowing that this I down here on the decimal key is the imaginary number. So imaginary is the square root of a -1. So if I do the square root of -1, since I'm in a real mode, this will not work because in real mode, all calculations must result in a real number. Square root of -1 is imaginary. So the square root of -1 is I. So I press second and then the decimal, and that gets me that I button. So now that's I. If I go into my mode and I turn my calculator from real into complex, then I can do the square root of -1 is I. That's where I is the square root of -1. So now it doesn't matter if I'm in real or complex mode, my I button is still useful. So if I go back to my real mode, I can type in 3I plus 2I, and it follows the same information as a regular variable, so that's the same thing as 3x plus 2x, but we have to remember that I does equal to the square root of -1. So this will still be 5I. Now, addition and subtraction follows the same thing with I as if it was a variable. So again, if I did 3I plus 2I, that's equal to 5I. The same way as if I did 3x plus 2x is equal to 5x. So those are the same thing. I can do the same thing if I did 5I minus 4I, and I get I. So 5I minus 4I is equal to 1I. The same thing as 5x minus 4x gives me 1x. They follow the same thing for variables. However, when I multiply, that's where it becomes a little different. Pi is a value as well, but it is a Greek letter, so people think of this as a variable. You can look at 3pi plus 2pi is equal to 5pi, and same thing with 5pi minus 4pi is equal to 1pi. So these are very similar in nature with variables, but pi and I are both actual numbers. They represent a specific value. X is a variable because it can represent any value. So when we're focusing on pi's and i's, it is very important to know that when you multiply, they do become different. So if I were to do 3i times 2i versus 3x times 2x versus 3pi times 2pi. All of these things are going to be different. So if I focus on the variables, 3x times 2x, that would give us 3 times 2 is 6, x times x is x squared. Same thing with 3 times 2 is 6, I times I is I squared. 3 times 2 is 6, pi times pi is pi squared. Now if I type in 3i, so 3 second I, times 2i, I should get 6i squared, but I don't. I get -6 because I is an actual value. I squared is actually equal to the value of -1. So this is really equal to 6 times -1, which gave us that -6. Now, we're not supposed to use x in our calculator because x is a variable, which means that it can be any value. So if I plug the value of 2 in for x, that'll completely change my value. If I type in 6pi squared, it'll give me something different as well. So if I type in 3pi times 2pi, so again, the pi is the blue button there, so second pi, I'm going to get a decimal because this is really pi squared, which 3.1415, continuing on, squared, then times 6 gives me an entire decimal of an irrational number, and it keeps going on. So all of these follow the same rules, but because I is a value, when you change I, the value changes as well. Just like if we were to plug any number in for x, the value will change. We can plug any number in for x, but I and pi are already values. So if I ever want to do anything with complex numbers, I can just use my I button here. You cannot use this in Desmos because Desmos does not recognize imaginary numbers. So I can do 2 plus 6i times 3 minus 7i. 3 minus 7i. And that'll actually give me a value of 48 plus 4i. Instead of having to try to distribute it the same way I would do with variables, with x's, i's can be done in the calculator. Anytime you see imaginary numbers, you can do it in the calculator. So if I turn my mode to complex down here instead of real, press enter on the a plus bi, I'm going to go copy and paste that last thing I did, and I get the same answer, 48 plus 4i. Because imaginary numbers can be done in a TI calculator, they cannot be done in Desmos. You can also do the same thing with fractions. You can do 2 plus 6i divided by 3 minus 7i. You do need to use parentheses on this. And you get some really weird numbers. I'm going to try and turn this into a fraction by pressing math. The first one is fraction, so I'm going to press math, enter, and then enter on that. And it gives me the fraction format of that decimal. So that's how you would divide those. You can still do them in the calculator, but you must use the parentheses. Because if you don't, then you're only dividing 6i by 3 instead of everything by 3 minus 7i. So it's very important. Parentheses are your backstabbing best friends.